Suddenly, the Russian Revolution erupted. And suddenly, here isn't just a dramatic word. It was truly a thunderbolt that struck everyone at a time when the entire world was stumbling through the chaos of the First World War. The Allies, Britain, France, Russia, Belgium, Serbia, Montenegro, and Japan were engaged in fierce, relentless battles against the Central Powers, Germany, Austria, Hungary, and alongside them, the Ottoman Empire. But what worried everyone wasn't just the violent upheaval of Russia's social order, or the intense internal struggles between its factions, or even the fate of the Tsar and his family. None of that really mattered back then, especially since the Bolsheviks hadn't yet taken power, and communism hadn't yet bared its teeth. The true danger lay in a powerful idea echoing through the Russian streets: peace and bread. The Russians who sparked the revolution, supported it, and had long suffered from hunger and deprivation, hated the war. A war that drained more men, more blood, more food, and more resources. They began calling for a separate peace with Germany, hoping it would bring an end to the fighting and bring back bread. To the rest of the Allies, this was nothing short of a disaster. A separate peace meant Germany could pull over 1 million soldiers from the East Front and hurl them westward. At a time when the Allies were already stretched thin, exhausted, and vulnerable. British and French forces were depleted to the bone. The Americans couldn't yet cross the Atlantic in time, so if Germany moved those troops to the west, it could very well crush the remnants of the Allies' strength and raise its flag over half of Europe. In response, British intelligence moved fast. In Department M11S, later known as M506, a man named William Wiseman began studying the situation with meticulous care, the way only the British do. Officially, he was in charge of foreign procurement. In reality, he was the head of British intelligence operations. He combed through dozens of files. He made countless calls to the American establishment, especially the White House, through his trusted contact, Edward House, advisor to President Woodrow Wilson. Then, Wiseman made a bold proposal. They needed to send a very special spy to Petrograd, formerly St. Petersburg, to assess the situation from the inside and determine what had to be done. To Wiseman, this spy had to be someone sharp, someone with insight, intelligence, analytical thinking, and the ability to assess the full picture. Someone with a strong personality and a perfect cover that would ward off suspicion. And so, he chose the last man anyone would expect: Somerset Maugham. At the time, Maugham was a famous and beloved author. His books were translated into multiple European languages. He lived permanently in Switzerland and had strong ties to many institutions and cultural circles. Choosing Maugham wasn't a crazy idea. In fact, British intelligence had been eyeing him since 1915. They believed a man like him could serve his country precisely because of his unique position and popularity. At the end of that year, an agent approached Maugham and made him an offer. To everyone's surprise, he accepted immediately. He was eager to help Britain, and he agreed to keep an eye on German agents and spies across Europe. In 1916, William Wiseman traveled to the United States, officially as the head of British procurement, but in truth, his mission was far more critical. He was there to run British intelligence operations on American soil, to launch propaganda campaigns, and to carry out counter-espionage activities. All at a time when the United States still had no formal intelligence agency of its own. From his post in America, Wiseman built powerful friendships with some of President Wilson's closest advisors, to the point that British intelligence effectively guided American policy from behind the scenes. And from that vantage point, Wiseman studied the Russian crisis, and made his final decision. Maugham was the one. Despite knowing the danger, Maugham accepted the mission. He packed his large suitcase, as usual, and departed for Petrograd. From the moment he arrived, he knew. This was not Switzerland. Not even close. Petrograd in 1917 was a storm of madness. A massive dump of revolutionaries, agitators, political lunatics, and chaos. And there he was, elegant, refined, wearing a wool coat in August, polished shoes, a cane with an ivory handle. He stood out like a diamond in a battlefield. Naturally, he attracted attention, suspicion. His only explanation for being there? He told people as a writer he needed to immerse himself in the environment for his next novel. To the tough, war-torn Russian people, this sounded ridiculous.
But ironically, the very absurdity of it saved him. Maugham looked nothing like a spy. He was thin, pale. His voice was quiet. He coughed often, an old case of tuberculosis. And, most notably, he made no attempt to hide his sexuality. He openly admired the young revolutionary sailors, with barely veiled fascination. Because of this, no one arrested him. Instead, they dismissed him, ignored him, as if returning his bold absurdity with indifference. And that was exactly what he wanted. Hidden in plain sight, Maugham began gathering information, analyzing, sending reports back to Wiseman. The first thing he realized, he was already too late. German propaganda had sunk deep into the Russian public. Everyone was sick of the war, calling for peace, for food, for a separate deal with Germany. Meanwhile, Germany was preparing the return of Lenin and the Bolshevik leaders to Russia, in what became known as the sealed train operation. Kerensky's government was crumbling, running out of breath, losing its grip. Maugham's early reports were deeply disappointing. To the British and Americans, they were a punch to the gut, a confirmation that the Eastern Front was about to collapse. He warned, the only way to reverse the damage caused by German propaganda was to flood the Russian government with money, enough to buy bread for the starving population. If people had food, they wouldn't listen to Bolshevik promises. They wouldn't need peace and bread if they already had bread. Because, as Maugham put it, nations, like armies, march on their stomachs. His backup plan? Direct military intervention. It was a wild idea, and no one knew if his first proposal could even be executed. Wiseman took his time to study both options carefully, too carefully, because before any action could be taken, events spun out of control. The Germans pulled it off. Their sealed train plan succeeded. Lenin and the other Bolsheviks arrived in Moscow, greeted by cheering crowds and unstoppable momentum. The revolution accelerated. The Bolsheviks took power in a shocking leap. Kerensky's provisional government collapsed. Kerensky himself fled the country, never to return. And the Allies? Their hearts sank. From day one, the new Bolshevik government declared, no more war, no more fighting. They wanted peace, and they meant it. At that moment, Maugham realized how vulnerable he was. He contacted the British urgently. Get me out of here, any way you can, and they did. They sent an entire British warship to extract him. But Maugham had to play the spy for real. For the first time in his life, he snuck through the streets, boarded a small boat, and when that failed, he swam through freezing waters until he reached the ship. The escape nearly killed him. By the time he reached Switzerland, he looked like a skeleton, pale as death, and checked into a clinic to recover. Meanwhile, Wiseman convinced President Wilson to make one of the biggest political mistakes in modern history: a military campaign against the Bolshevik government. Wilson agreed. The Allies landed troops in Russia. Over 13,000 American soldiers joined secret operations meant to crush the Bolsheviks before they could consolidate power. It failed, miserably. The war ended. Germany was defeated. The Ottoman Empire collapsed. But Russia descended into civil war. Wilson signed off on operations he believed would change the course of history. They didn't. They created something else. Endless hostility between the Bolsheviks and the West. A rift that shaped the 20th century. Eventually, Maugham recovered. But his only obsession was to prove to British intelligence, especially Wiseman, that he had been a loyal spy, that every report he wrote was real and accurate. No one cared. They considered him spent, physically, mentally, and emotionally. No one would ever trust him with another mission. But Maugham wasn't done. In the early 1950s, he made a rebellious decision. He published a book. I Was a Spy. It rocked the literary and political world. No one had suspected this beloved author was once a secret agent. The Russians were furious. They regretted ever letting him wander freely through their land. The British stayed silent. The Americans ignored him, and the Russians flat out denied he was ever there. But the book? It became a bestseller. #1 for an entire year. Maugham basked in the fame and let it go to his head. His later writings took a strange turn, toward decadence and moral shock. Critics abandoned him. Readers turned away. All that remained was his legacy as a man who once held the pen and used it as a weapon.